Welcome back, dear learners. Let's continue from our previous lecture. This is the second part of Unit 7, Public Finance. We now enter the tackling critical issue of fiscal crisis and fiscal deficit. There is a difference between the two. A fiscal deficit happens when a government spends more than it earns. This is common. A fiscal crisis, however, is more severe. It is when the government cannot meet its financial obligations like paying off debts or funding services. What causes these problems? Economic downturns like recession, lower tax revenue, while increasing the need for welfare spending. Political decisions play a huge role. Governments often use expansionary policies to gain popularity, or they suffer from corruption and inefficient resource allocation. Structural issues such as an aging population or long term growth slowdowns can permanently imbalance the books. The consequences of a fiscal crisis are severe. Regarding economic stability, persistent deficit leads to high public debt, making the country vulnerable to shocks and rising interest rates. In terms of public services, crises force governments to cut off spendings on essentials like education and healthcare. This impacts social well being, leading to unemployment and social unrest. How do policymakers respond? They often pursue fiscal consolidation. This means cutting spending or rising taxes. They attempt revenue mobilization, which involves broadening the tax base and stopping tax evasion. They implement structural reforms to enhance productivity and prevent future crises. We look at the International Monetary Fund (IMF). The IMF provides financial assistance to countries in distress. A key instrument is the Structural Adjustment Policy loan. These loans are designed to support economic reforms. Crucially, they are often tied to conditions such as reducing the gross fiscal deficit. The goal is to enforce fiscal discipline. To understand this, we must distinguish between types of deficits and expenditures. A revenue deficit is the gap between what the government receives in taxes and what it spends on day to day operations, revenue expenditure. If this is high, it means the government is borrowing just to keep the lights on, which is unsustainable. We must also distinguish between expenditures. Revenue expenditure does not create assets, example, salaries, defense. Capital expenditure does generate future income, example, building bridges, investing in R&D. The IMF encourages shifting focus towards capital expenditure for sustainable growth. We now shift our focus to the impact of reforms, starting with economic reforms and their impact on poverty. Studies examining the period from 1993 to 2000, revealing interesting trends. Rural poverty saw a notable decline, dropping from 31.6% to 28.8%. This was driven by reforms promoting agricultural productivity and non agricultural employment in villages. However, urban poverty saw a much smaller decline of only 0.5%. Why was this progress slower? Factors include the slower pace of job creation in cities relative to immigration, rising costs of living, housing and transport, and limited social protection for the urban poor. It is important to note that estimates of poverty reduction vary across studies. from 10% to 3% due to differences in data methodologies. However, the implication is clear. Inclusive growth strategies must target the specific needs of the urban poor, who often get left behind in the macro growth story. Now, we analyze economic reforms and employment. India has implemented key reforms like the consolidation of 29 labor laws into 4 codes in 2020, the implementation of GST in 2017, and FDI liberalization. What is the impact? Regarding job creation, while unemployment fluctuates, the formal sector is growing. In 2021, organized sector employment rose by 3.5%. Regarding wages, the ILO reports that India's average real wage growth increased by 5.5% between 2016 and 2020. Regarding skill development, the Skill India initiative have trained over 96 million people by September 2021. However, a challenge remains the informal sector. It still accounts for 81% of employment. While GST encourages formalization, many small businesses struggle with compliances, which can lead to job losses in these vulnerable sectors. We look at investment. Reforms like the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code IBC and GST were designed to make business easier. The results are statistically significant. FDI inflows grew by 19% in the fiscal year 2020 to 2021, reaching a massive $59.64 billion. India's ranking in the World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index jumped from 142th position in 2014 to 63rd position in 2020. The startup ecosystem has exploded, with over 50,000 startups raising over $70 billion between 2014 to 2021. Furthermore, the manufacturing sector driven by Make in India registered a compound annual growth rate of 6.5% in gross value added between 2014 and 2021. These figures indicate a robust positive response from the investment community to the structural reforms. Now we have foreign trade. Reforms like the foreign trade policy and the ratification of the WTO's trade facilitation agreement aimed to boost competitiveness. The impact is mixed but growing. Exports increased to $330.1 billion in 2020-21. However, the trade deficit, the gap between imports and exports, widened to $120.4 billion. A bright spot is services trade, where India maintained a healthy surplus of $82.8 billion, driven by the IT sector. We are also seeing export diversification into engineering, goods, and pharmaceuticals, reducing reliance on traditional commodities. Now we have arrived at a critical critic titled Neglect of Agriculture, the major sin of economic reforms. Agriculture is the backbone of the Indian economy, contributing nearly 18% to GDP and employing over 41% of the workforce. Yet, reforms have largely bypassed this sector. Consider the growth rate. Between 2011 and 2021, the agriculture sector grew at 3.1%, while the overall GDP grew at 6.8%. Consider investment. Public investment in agriculture is less than 3% of the total public expenditure. This lack of funding for research and infrastructure stifles productivity. The consequences are devastating. Farmers' distress is acute, with over 330,000 farmers' suicide recorded between 1995 and 2020. Despite high production, India ranks poorly on the Global Hunger Index, highlighting a failure in food security and distribution. What is the way forward? The neglect must be reversed through targeted actions. First, the government must increase public investment in irrigation and research. Second, we must improve credit availability so small farmers are not reliant on exploitative moneylenders. Third, agricultural marketing needs reforms to ensure farmers get fair prices. Fourth, we must promote sustainable practices to stop environmental degradation like soil erosion. Finally, direct income support scheme like PM Kisan needs strengthening to provide a safety net. Only by addressing these core issues can the major sin of neglect be atoned for. In our conclusion, our journey through Unit 7 has shown us that public finance is the complex balancing act. We have seen how Vigo's principle of equity and efficiency guide the government's hand. We have analyzed the necessary but painful process of fiscal consolidation and the role of the IMF. We have also seen the tangible results of reforms, booming investments and service exports, rising formal employment, yet a persistent trade deficit and a heartbreaking neglect of the agricultural sector. The lesson for future policymakers is clear. Economic policy cannot just be about growth rates. It must be about inclusive development that bridges the gap between the urban rich and the rural poor. Thank you for your attention to this detailed study of public finance.